Inside La Sabaneta Prison, the jail known for extreme violence and abuse. In western Venezuela once stood a prison whose name became synonymous with chaos, bloodshed, and state failure. La Sabaneta Prison was not simply overcrowded. It was a place where authorities were repeatedly accused of losing control, where inmates allegedly governed sections of the prison themselves, and where one of Latin America's deadliest prison massacres shocked the world. For years, families feared the phone calls that came from inside. Prisoners feared the nights. And officials faced a question they could no longer avoid: how had a prison become more dangerous than the streets outside? Tonight, we examine the rise and collapse of La Sabaneta Prison, the jail known for extreme violence and abuse. If you value factual documentaries like this, support the channel by liking the video, subscribing to Behind the Bars, and telling us where you're watching from. Your support helps us continue bringing you more powerful true stories. A prison built for another era. La Sabaneta Prison was located in Maracaibo, one of Venezuela's largest cities and an important oil region. Like many prisons in Latin America built in earlier decades, the facility was designed for a smaller inmate population and a more controlled system than what later developed. As Venezuela's prison population rose, many institutions struggled with capacity, staffing, and deteriorating infrastructure. La Sabaneta would become one of the most severe examples. Cells filled beyond intended limits. Basic services came under pressure. And authority inside the walls became increasingly fragile. Overcrowding becomes crisis. Overcrowding was one of the defining problems of La Sabaneta. Human rights groups and journalists reported that the number of prisoners often far exceeded official capacity. In some periods, inmates reportedly slept in hallways, improvised spaces, or stacked sleeping arrangements. Overcrowding creates more than discomfort. It strains sanitation. It increases tension. It reduces supervision. It spreads disease faster. And in prisons where order is already weak, it can become the foundation for violence. At La Sabaneta, critics said overcrowding was not an isolated issue. It was the system itself. Power shifts to inmates. One of the most disturbing allegations surrounding La Sabaneta was that internal control had partially shifted from officials to prisoners. Across several Venezuelan prisons during that era, reports described inmate leaders, sometimes called prans in local contexts, who exercised authority inside facilities through intimidation, organized hierarchies, and violence. Accounts varied over time and by prison. But repeated reporting suggested that in some areas, prison staff did not maintain full day-to-day control. When authority fragments inside a prison, rules become unpredictable. And when rules become unpredictable, fear becomes constant. Life behind the walls. Former inmates, family members, and rights organizations described harsh living conditions inside La Sabaneta. Water shortages, poor sanitation, limited medical care, overcrowded sleeping areas, contraband economies, violence between rival groups. Not every account described the same unit or same period, but the broader pattern was consistent enough to make La Sabaneta internationally notorious. For prisoners, daily life often depended not only on official rules, but on who controlled space, resources, and protection. Inside troubled prisons, survival can become its own currency. Families outside the gates. In many under-resourced prison systems, families provide essential support: food, medicine, clothing, money for basic needs. At La Sabaneta, relatives reportedly waited in long lines for visits, often bringing supplies prisoners could not reliably access through official channels. That meant incarceration reached beyond the inmate. Mothers, spouses, siblings, and children became part of the prison economy simply to help loved ones endure it. When violence erupted inside, those same families were often the last to receive clear information. Why violence kept returning? Violence inside prison rarely comes from nowhere. It grows where systems fail. Too many inmates, too few staff, weak accountability, slow courts keeping pretrial detainees locked up for long periods, limited rehabilitation, contraband markets, rival factions. La Sabaneta reportedly suffered from many of these pressures at once. That does not excuse individual crimes committed there, but it helps explain why repeated bloodshed was possible. A reputation beyond Venezuela. By the early 2000s, La Sabaneta had become known beyond Venezuela as one of the country's most dangerous prisons. Human rights advocates cited it as evidence of wider prison system collapse. Journalists used it as a symbol of overcrowding and state weakness. Families knew it as a place where a loved one could disappear into violence. And inmates across the region understood the name immediately. Some prisons are feared locally. La Sabaneta became feared nationally. The disaster approaches. Warnings had existed for years. Overcrowding, weapons, internal gang structures, weak control, tension between groups. Yet the prison remained open. Then in 2013, La Sabaneta would become the site of one of the deadliest prison incidents in modern Latin American history. And after that day, its future would change forever. A system under pressure. La Sabaneta's crisis did not exist in isolation. By the early 2010s, Venezuela's wider prison system faced major pressure. Overcrowding, delayed court cases, shortages of staff, aging facilities, and recurring unrest in multiple institutions. When one prison struggles, inmates can be transferred elsewhere. When many prisons struggle at once, options shrink. That is when local crises become national emergencies. La Sabaneta was one of the clearest warnings that the system itself was under strain. Delays that filled the cells. A major contributor to overcrowding in many Latin American prisons has long been judicial delay. Some detainees spend extended periods awaiting trial or sentencing. Others remain incarcerated while cases move slowly through overloaded courts. This means prisons hold not only sentenced inmates, but large numbers of people still moving through the legal process. When delays multiply, cells fill faster than space can be created. At La Sabaneta, critics argued that prison violence could not be separated from court backlogs outside the walls. The hidden economy inside. Where official systems fail, unofficial systems often emerge. Reports from Venezuelan prisons described internal economies where inmates exchanged food, space, protection, communication access, and daily necessities. Such systems can become highly organized. Those with influence gain control over resources. Those without influence become vulnerable. In prisons with weak governance, power often follows scarcity. La Sabaneta was repeatedly described through that lens. Families living the sentence too. For families, prison sentences often become shared hardship. Travel costs, waiting lines, fear during lockdowns, uncertainty after disturbances. Many relatives of La Sabaneta inmates reportedly depended on fragmented information from rumors, phone calls, or media coverage. When violence threatened inside, those outside the gates were left to wait. And waiting can be its own punishment. The 2013 crisis begins. In January 2013, authorities moved to search La Sabaneta and restore order after mounting concerns over weapons and instability inside the prison. What followed became an international headline. During the operation, violence erupted. Official accounts and reporting varied on some details in the immediate aftermath, but the scale of the tragedy was clear. Dozens of people were killed. Many more were injured. It became one of the deadliest prison incidents in the region in years. Shock across the country. The incident shocked Venezuela. Families rushed to the prison seeking information. Hospitals received the wounded. News organizations across Latin America covered the story. Human rights advocates said the tragedy reflected years of ignored warnings. Officials promised investigations and reform. When disasters occur suddenly, they often expose problems that built slowly over time. La Sabaneta's name was now known worldwide. Why it happened? No single cause explains a prison catastrophe. Experts pointed to a combination of factors often seen in failing institutions: overcrowding, weak internal control, contraband, delayed justice processes, insufficient staffing, poor infrastructure, slow reform. When enough structural failures overlap, a spark can become a crisis. La Sabaneta was not the result of one bad day. It was the result of many unresolved years. The decision to close it. After the 2013 tragedy, Venezuelan authorities announced that La Sabaneta would be emptied and eventually shut down. Prisoners were transferred elsewhere. The closure was presented as part of broader efforts to address prison violence and improve conditions. For critics, closing the facility was necessary, but overdue. For families, it came too late for those already lost. And for observers, La Sabaneta became a symbol of what happens when warnings go unanswered. After the gates closed. When La Sabaneta was shut down, the prison did not simply disappear. Its inmates had to be transferred. Its staff reassigned. Its legacy absorbed by an already strained prison system. Closing a notorious prison can remove one symbol of failure. It does not automatically solve the problems that created it. Overcrowding can move elsewhere. Violence can shift locations. Judicial delays can continue. Without deeper reform, closure may change the map, but not the system. Venezuela's wider prison crisis. La Sabaneta was one prison, but it reflected broader national challenges. Throughout the 2000s and 2010s, Venezuela faced repeated criticism over prison overcrowding, riots, shortages, and inmate-run internal structures in some facilities. Human rights groups argued that prisons had become overcrowded holding zones rather than secure correctional institutions. Officials announced reform efforts at different times, including new ministries and modernization plans. But progress was uneven. La Sabaneta became the most famous case because its collapse was impossible to ignore. When inmates rule inside. One of the most alarming patterns described in parts of Venezuela's prison system was the rise of internal inmate leadership structures. Where staff control weakens, unofficial hierarchies can emerge. Those groups may regulate movement, control resources, impose punishments, or settle disputes through force. This creates two prison systems at once, the official one on paper, and the unofficial one inside the walls. At La Sabaneta, reports suggested that blurred line became one of the prison's defining dangers. What families remember. For relatives of former inmates, La Sabaneta is not remembered through statistics. It is remembered through fear. The phone call that came late. The visit canceled without explanation. The rumor of unrest spreading through the city. The wait outside gates for names to be confirmed. When prisons fail, families often carry the memory longest. Long after walls are emptied, anxiety remains. Why prisons become violent. Extreme prison violence usually grows from conditions, not mythology. Too many inmates, too little staff, weak accountability, slow courts, scarcity of food or medicine, poor infrastructure, unresolved rivalries, lack of rehabilitation. These pressures can exist for years before the public notices. Then one crisis reveals everything at once. La Sabaneta became known worldwide because the warning signs had been visible long before disaster struck. A symbol of state failure. Some prisons become symbols larger than themselves. La Sabaneta came to represent not only prison violence, but institutional breakdown. When the state cannot maintain order, safety, or humane conditions inside a prison, confidence in public institutions weakens outside it too. That is why prison crises matter beyond prison walls. They reveal how systems function under pressure. Or fail under it. Could it have been prevented? After major prison disasters, the same question always follows. Could this have been prevented? Experts often point to known solutions: reduce overcrowding, speed up court processes, improve staffing, increase transparency, separate rival groups safely, provide healthcare and mental health services, maintain infrastructure. The challenge is rarely knowing what helps. It is acting before tragedy forces action. The name that remains. Today, La Sabaneta no longer operates as it once did. But its name remains in discussions of the world's most dangerous prisons. Not because it was mysterious, because it was documented. Overcrowding, abuse allegations, weak control, mass casualty violence. Its story is a warning written in concrete and steel. A prison ignored long enough can become more dangerous than the people inside it. What happens after closure? When a prison closes, many assume the problem ends. But closure often creates new pressures. Inmates must be relocated. Other prisons absorb higher populations. Staff lose positions or transfer elsewhere. Families must adapt to new travel distances and visitation systems. If the larger correctional system is already struggling, shutting one facility may simply move instability somewhere else. That is why experts often say prison reform cannot depend on closures alone. It must address the structure behind them. The burden on other prisons. After La Sabaneta's closure, Venezuelan authorities transferred prisoners to other institutions. Transfers can reduce pressure in one place, but they can increase pressure elsewhere. Receiving prisons may face more crowding, new rivalries, strained staffing, security complications, medical and administrative delays. This is a challenge seen worldwide when prison systems operate near capacity. Without long-term planning, one solution can become another crisis. The human rights debate. La Sabaneta also intensified debates over prisoner rights in Latin America. Human rights organizations argued that incarceration should never mean exposure to preventable violence, degrading conditions, or uncontrolled internal rule. Governments often respond that prisons must manage dangerous offenders under difficult financial and security conditions. Both realities can exist at once. But international standards generally hold that imprisonment removes liberty, not basic human dignity. When prisons fail that standard, criticism follows. Why overcrowding is so dangerous? Overcrowding is more than a numbers problem. It affects nearly everything. Sanitation worsens. Conflicts rise faster. Medical access slows. Food distribution becomes harder. Staff supervision weakens. Disease spreads more easily. Emergency evacuations become harder. In overcrowded prisons, small problems can escalate rapidly. At La Sabaneta, repeated reporting suggested crowding was one of the core forces behind instability. Why courts matter to prison safety. Many prison crises begin outside prison walls. When courts move slowly, pretrial detention grows. When sentencing systems overuse incarceration, capacity strains. When alternatives to custody are limited, overcrowding worsens. This means prison safety is often tied to judges, lawmakers, and prosecutors as much as wardens. La Sabaneta became a reminder that criminal justice systems function as one chain. If one link fails, pressure reaches the cells. Why people still watch stories like this? Viewers are drawn to notorious prison stories for many reasons. Some seek true crime history. Some want to understand hidden systems. Some are fascinated by how institutions collapse. Others want answers to a deeper question. What happens when society locks people away and stops looking? La Sabaneta remains compelling because it is not only about crime. It is about power, neglect, and consequences. Lessons written in concrete. If La Sabaneta teaches anything, it is that warning signs are usually visible early. Crowding. Staff shortages. Repeated unrest. Poor infrastructure. Lack of transparency. Family complaints. Ignored reports. Disasters often seem sudden only to those who were not paying attention. To those inside, the danger may have been building for years. A prison gone, a warning left behind. La Sabaneta no longer dominates headlines the way it once did. But its legacy remains. It stands as a warning of what can happen when incarceration outpaces capacity, when control weakens, and when reform comes only after tragedy. Some prisons are remembered for famous inmates. Others for escapes. La Sabaneta is remembered for collapse. And in the final chapter, we ask what its story reveals about prisons around the world. Prisons as mirrors of society. Prisons often reveal the pressures already present outside their walls. Poverty. Political instability. Weak institutions. Court backlogs. Corruption. Public neglect. These problems do not disappear at the prison gate. They are concentrated there. La Sabaneta became notorious partly because it reflected wider national stresses in an enclosed environment where failure became impossible to hide. The cost paid by the poor. Across the world, prison populations are disproportionately drawn from poorer communities. Limited access to legal defense, unstable employment, lower education opportunities, and vulnerable living conditions all contribute to unequal outcomes. That means when prison systems collapse, the burden often falls hardest on families already under strain. La Sabaneta's story was not only about inmates. It was also about the communities from which many of them came. When fear becomes routine. One of the most damaging features of violent prisons is normalization. Fear becomes routine. Extortion becomes routine. Injury becomes routine. Emergency lockdowns become routine. When abnormal conditions become daily life, reform becomes harder because dysfunction starts to feel ordinary. Repeated reporting on La Sabaneta suggested this was one of its deepest problems. Crisis was no longer exceptional. It had become expected. The staff trapped inside too. Correctional staff are often overlooked in stories about prison collapse. Yet officers, administrators, healthcare workers, and support staff work inside the same unstable environment. They face threats, burnout, understaffing, and constant stress. Where systems fail, staff morale often declines and retention becomes difficult. That can accelerate collapse further. At troubled prisons, inmates are not the only people trapped by dysfunction. Workers can be too. Why reform so often comes late? Many prison reforms happen after scandals, not before them. Why? Because prisons are politically easy to ignore. The public rarely sees inside them. Those affected often have limited voice. Budgets compete with more visible priorities. As a result, warnings may be dismissed until tragedy forces action. La Sabaneta followed that familiar pattern. Could it happen elsewhere? La Sabaneta was extreme, but the underlying risks are not unique. Anywhere prisons face severe overcrowding, weak staffing, poor accountability, and delayed justice systems, instability can grow. Different countries manage these pressures differently. Some contain them. Some ignore them. Some react only after disaster. That is why La Sabaneta matters beyond Venezuela. Its story is a warning relevant worldwide. What real prevention looks like. Experts often point to practical ways to reduce prison crisis risk. adequate staffing, transparent oversight, timely court processes, safe housing capacity, medical and mental health services, training, violence prevention systems, reentry planning. None of these are dramatic, but they are often the difference between stability and collapse. The name that endured. Many prisons close and are forgotten. La Sabaneta did not. Its name endured because it became shorthand for something larger. What happens when incarceration expands faster than institutions can manage it? What happens when warnings go unanswered? What happens when control inside prison walls breaks down? That is why people still remember it today. What families never forget. Long after a prison closes, families often carry its memory. The anxiety of waiting for updates. The fear during riots or lockdowns. The uncertainty of whether a loved one was safe. The financial strain of travel, food deliveries, and legal support. For relatives connected to La Sabaneta, the prison was never just a building. It was years of worry tied to a name. When prison systems fail, families often live with the consequences longest. Why the story still matters. Some may ask why a closed prison still deserves attention. Because La Sabaneta illustrates a larger truth. Prison crises rarely begin with one riot or one headline. They begin with neglected systems, ignored warnings, slow institutions, invisible suffering. When those pressures build behind walls, the public often notices only after tragedy. That pattern remains relevant in many countries today. Could the outcome have been different? Most major prison disasters are not mysteries after the fact. Warning signs are usually visible: severe overcrowding, weak staffing, poor infrastructure, repeated unrest, lack of transparency. Experts often know the remedies before catastrophe happens. The challenge is political will, funding, and urgency. If those had arrived earlier, La Sabaneta's story may have looked very different. Final judgment of history. History tends to remember institutions for what they became, not what they intended to be. La Sabaneta may once have been designed as a correctional facility, but it became known internationally for overcrowding, violence, abuse allegations, and deadly collapse. That reputation was not created by rumor alone. It was built through repeated reporting, documented crises, and public tragedy. Some names become warnings. La Sabaneta is one of them. La Sabaneta prison is gone. But the questions it raised remain. How should societies punish without creating greater violence? How long can broken systems be ignored? And how many warnings are missed before reform finally arrives? Its walls may be closed. Its lessons are not. If you enjoyed this factual documentary, subscribe to Behind the Bars for more deep stories on prisons, crime, and hidden systems around the world.